It's my huge pleasure today to introduce Adeline Brion of Lie Detectors, based over in Brussels, who has very generously joined us at the 11th hour after our planned speaker has unfortunately fallen ill. In the background, we have my colleagues, one in London, Courtney Bonnet, who supports the Commonwealth Centre for Connected Learning in Malta, and my colleagues Kirk Perez and Kushin Feng, who are of the Commonwealth of Learning Vancouver, who commissioned this project along with the Commonwealth Centre for Connected Learning over in Malta. And before I start to really map the journey we've been on so far, to reintroduce myself, some of you who've been going through the course content may recognise my face, having popped up on a few of the videos. My name's Emma Pauncefort, and it's been a huge, huge pleasure to work on this project, the Digital Literacy Lab for Educators. I'm based over in the UK, and it is my real mission and vision to really support both educators and the next generation in such a timely and crucial human skill, and one, of course, that we've really been thinking much more about since the COVID-19 pandemic and accompanying info crisis has come onto our radars. So we find ourselves in this third session, and we've had two others that have accompanied the DLLE MOOC. We started what feels like many moons ago with Professor Gary Falloon over of Macquarie University down in Sydney, and we really sort of started off exploring some of these labels and terms, and I think that's something that will come onto our radars again today, of how we label things and how that helps us navigate this information ecosystem that we find online. And then a couple of weeks ago, Jeanette Ballard of the BBC and Be Smart Cookie generously joined us and got us really thinking more about the urgency of needing to navigate our information landscape online. And today we move even further from these bigger discussions and understanding of the problem we have at hand to thinking a bit more about tangible takeaways. What can we do both on the ground, wherever we are as educators in classrooms, but also pairing that with the need to really push for sort of top-down change as well, and thinking about policy as well. So to reiterate, it's my huge pleasure to introduce Adeline Brion, who is based over, you are in Brussels, right?
Yes, exactly.
And before I can, sometimes I Frenchify or de-Frenchify names or relocate people, so good. So
it was perfect.
Tuning in from Brussels, so up here in Europe. And just to give a sense of how this session is going to run, we really do invite you to make ample use of the chat, and our job is to have a discussion, really elucidate and expand on this topic of digital creation and consumption, and really see where the hour takes us. So without further ado, I'd love to hand over to you, Adeline, and I'll be here interjecting with various points, and questions will feed through to me. And I suppose the final point, I keep threatening to hand over to you, but the final point, because I'd love to pick up on what someone has said in the chat, which I think actually frames things so nicely and poignantly for us. So Tobias Amalone, I hope I have pronounced your name correctly, over in Kenya, and he's posed the question, how do we prepare learners to cope with disinformation, fake news, and radicalization on digital media platforms? And I think happily that's what we're about to address. So over to you, Adeline.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you so much for the nice introduction. and I'm very delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting lie detectors. I'll try to make it up to you, as I know that Juliana is such a passionate speaker and is actually the founder of lie detectors, so is the best person to talk about it, but I'll try to do my best. So maybe a little word about me. So I'm Adeline, and I'm born and raised in Brussels. And I've been at lie detectors for 2 years, a bit more than 2 years now, actually. And it was my pleasure to work here with Belgian journalists and teachers about news, to talk about news literacy. Basically, a little word about lie detectors. So lie detectors is a news literacy program that is led by journalists. And we deploy, we select and train journalists to then deploy them into classrooms to talk about disinformation, how to counter it, but also to talk about ethical journalism and the functioning of ethical journalism. So you're going to ask us, okay, like how did we get into the business of lie detecting, if we call it like that? Well, I think the first thing to say, it's clearly, and probably it's not a surprise to any of you, it's a growing concern for democracy, and I think it's worth for many people. It's something that actually made Juliana start lie detectors in 2017. We are funded by the WIS Foundation, so we pay a very great. We are very proud to say that we are independent from any commercial funding or from any political influence. And so we are running into in 3 different countries. So Belgium, where I am, but also Austria and Germany. And we'd like to expand further. So we started the lie detector thing because we were really worried about many developments, and maybe one of the first one is this threat to our democracy that I was just talking about. Basically, we can see everywhere since already a few years now many worrying developments and this lack of trust in facts that is kind of now really developing. And then the second point is really, we're very worried about those fakes that are kind of going under the radar, increasingly going under the radar. What I'm talking about is basically that we not only have disinformation that is now on Facebook or on Twitter, but it's also becoming this splicing up of fact and fiction that is happening maybe on WhatsApp or on TikTok, or in the form of in a pixelated form on Instagram or on Snapchat. And this is something that cannot be addressed by fact checkers everywhere, because they cannot be everywhere. And even if they were, then it would be a bit dangerous if it was not, it could backfire if we don't pay attention to this growing lack of trust in journalism. So why would you trust fact checkers if you don't trust journalists? And then we're also a bit worried about this business model of the platforms that I'm sure you've already mentioned in the course of your former debates. So of course, we really think as well that there is this this worrying trend to monetize outrage and fears and other human emotions, and that there are probably ways to kind of rethink about this type of models. And in the end, we have really this slow drip of disinformation that has been going on for years now, and it kind of shapes our entire relationship to facts, that shapes our relationship to the world, and that is really a growing concern for us, that kind of, I think, made the whole team go into that business of lie detecting. But mostly, I think it was the basis of the decision of Juliana to start this initiative after 20 years in journalism, because basically it made little sense at that moment to put all these efforts into creating this beautiful, meaningful, well thought through journalism when in the end many people were no longer able to make the difference between an outright lie and that. So that was really one of the first. It's a bit of a gloomy picture that I put there, but I think it's important to see where we are coming from. And now we are here working with 200 journalists and going into classrooms all over Europe, and we are now training them interactively, now with the pandemic also in a digital way, to enter the classrooms to do two things. First, those journalists are talking about disinformation as such. Why is it there? Who does that? For what reason? And what tools do we have to fight against this? But then we also have this other part of, okay, we're going to talk about professional ethical journalism and also media bias. And that's why we're working with journalists fundamentally, because we really think that it's also an opportunity for them to, step away from their desk and have that conversation about reporting truth, reporting facts, and have that conversation about also how it can go wrong with quality journalism as well, because it's not an easy task. And it is a particularly important task when we think about how our media is now under pressure and under attack. And this is really important to make that, to empower students all over, well, for us Europe, but probably all over Europe, over the world, to make this difference between lies and then a well-intended but flawed reporting from journalists. So we're doing that within 90 minutes. It's not that much time, but it's enough to have this little connection, this little putting a face on a journalist and on this profession, and to really break those silos that we have between the journalists and also the news consumers, but also the classroom, and then the best practices that exist in media literacy, because then we give those teachers and their classrooms all the resources that they could use in their room. Now, because of that, when we're through doing that, excuse me, pardon my English, I think we've learned a lot of things. But before going to that, maybe I should probably quiz you first. I'd like to see if our audience is actually consuming news in different ways than the ones we surveyed throughout those years and throughout our work in the classrooms. So maybe I can, if I can ask you to put in the chat what platforms you would use to consume information in general. So please feel free to put a lot of them. Think about your usual behavior, I would say, and I would say I'll give you 30 seconds. What do you think, Emma?
Sure. And this is news or any information, any sort, where
news, mostly news. Yes, let's say news to be clear. So this could be, I don't know, TV, but also social media or traditional media in different forms. That could
excellent. This will be an interesting one.
Exactly. So I see WhatsApp, Twitter, print media, local news agencies. That's great. Websites. Yeah.
Interesting to see sort of YouTube, isn't it? Because you then think, well, there's so many different channels. So which, it's a whole mass, isn't it?
It's a fairly recent development, I would say, huh?
Absolutely. As you share your screen, Adeline, I'm having a zip down and seeing what we've got, and it's a real very interesting mix. We've got TV. We do have
the TV is coming back quite often, huh?
Yeah, and that's an interesting one. So the Reuters Institute over here, over in Oxford, they've done various sort of reports.
Exactly. It's really a trendy topic to look into, because actually it says a lot about what we're doing and what we should maybe do. So maybe I will Yeah, share my. But are you seeing? Yes, you're seeing the right thing, right?
Absolutely.
So this is data that we collected from our students and teachers in 2019. And what we saw is, well, basically we classify that, as you can see, in the consumption of the students. So we have mostly YouTube, just as we mentioned in the chat, which is quite funny.
Yeah.
I have to admit, here we didn't. It was on social media only, and what we have is YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram taking the lead. But interestingly, Snapchat and TikTok coming next. And if you look at the numbers from teachers, so we interviewed school children aged 10 to 15 and teachers, we see that the numbers there are super different. While Facebook has this had this lead for teachers, and of course with WhatsApp and YouTube that seem to be the same. And then what is even more intriguing is that we thought, okay, that's interesting. That's something that we should go on and we should do again. And then we did the same with numbers from 2020, but then we added different different platforms. And what we noticed is that apart from WhatsApp, when we asked the students where they got their information from, it was mostly visual platforms. And that is really an interesting development. And that reflects on what I was just saying before, you know, that this information is going a bit under the radar. It's typically way more difficult to fact check, you know, a screenshot that goes from TikTok to Instagram than the rest. However, this is what is consumed by the students we have surveyed in those 3 countries. So this is data that was gathered from students in classrooms in Belgium, Germany, and Austria. And so that was that's so, as I said, it's really reflects what I was saying, but it's also one of our major finding is that after we showed that to the teachers, they told us as well that they are 100%, not 100%, sorry, 80% aware of this importance of media literacy as teaching subject, but then only half of them are actually teaching media literacy. And that's why we're also doing what we're doing with our journalists, is that when we enter a classroom, we want to talk to those students to, okay, give this, have like awaken their interest, but also to the teachers because we know that they're interested. So we want to keep that flame, that interest, but we also want to show that, okay, there are ways to do that, and it is not something impossible, even though, of course, they're probably lacking training in most of the regions we are going to. Sorry, I'm rearranging my screen because now I don't see you anymore. There you are.
I'm still here.
So yes, I think it's really one of the main findings that we had from our operations, and it has also a very strong effect. So that's to say that 100% of the teachers after a visit would say, okay, I need follow-up material, and we would gladly give that, even though we have some teachers, you know, that invite a lie detector journalist because they want to have a break in their very busy day, and which is totally normal. But even in that condition, even in that context, they still want this material. So eventually, what we want to do with lie detectors, and maybe that I'll stop with this and leave the space for question. What we want to do is really energize the teachers to adopt this approach and to really integrate that in their teaching, and that has already happened in many classrooms that we visited in the past. Those teachers now are more confident in tackling this and are aware of the different resources that are available for them. And eventually, we also want critical media literacy to be integrated in teacher training, and this regardless of the subject of teaching, you know, so that every teacher, regardless of their topic, is able to kind of have that source verification, critical media literacy point integrated, weaved into their teaching as a normal skill. No, I think I'll stop there because otherwise I can go on with my monologue. I will be happy to really dive into a few of these points. I think I haven't talked about what OECD is thinking about that. I haven't talked about what we are doing now for COVID. So please feel free to dig and ask for more, I would say. And I will maybe unshare my screen. Now I realize I'm still sharing.
No, that's super. Thank you so much. And I can see already there's some also reflections on good practice, shall we say, or what's happening on the ground. And of course, I think that's the part of the landscape, isn't it? That different countries have different sort of focus in their curricula. And someone who's joined us from Malta has highlighted that actually it is this idea of media literacy. There are moves to introduce it and transversely across subject areas, and indeed, of course, we've got the example of Finland, which we addressed in our previous session. And to pick up on, you know, one of the questions, could the low number of teachers teaching media literacy be due to lack of know-how? I think, well, that's absolutely what you've been tackling, and I'd love at this point to ask a little bit more about how do you cross that bridge between the education space and journalism? Journalists, of course, being, you know, of course, there's linkage with education, but how do you interest those stakeholders? How do you bring them together? So for those participants, individuals who are joining us from all different locations, this feels like part of that. You know, that's an action point, really, isn't it? That we can't do this on our own as educators. We have to look to those who are the gatekeepers of news affairs and how these news stories are narrated. So what is it? How do we merge those two worlds? And what are the sort of tangible steps? What are the things that you can do to really engage, I suppose, journalists and build that bridge? So once you're, I suppose, that symbiotic relationship that you were talking about, because on the one hand, it gives that refresher, doesn't it, for journalists who are understanding, you know, what their new audiences are and what the challenges they face. And then on the flip side, you know, myself, you know, included, us as news readers and consumers of information online, we then understand what the sort of gold standard is of producing this material. So yeah, broadly, how do we start to build those bridges and affect the sort of programs that you've been doing in Belgium, Germany, and Austria?
Well, I think this is actually engaging journalists, if we're talking specifically about journalists, is actually not that difficult, because you know what? Our journalists keep telling us this is such a refreshing view for them. You know, they really enjoy doing that. I mean, at first, of course, the intention, it's really the journalists, for their profession by nature, they are fact checkers, critical thinkers. They are thinking about that. And then, of course, because of this growing pressure on journalism, they have to, they kind of interrogate themselves on, okay, what can they do? And then entering a classroom and having this I would say personal connection. I mean, no, I want to say face-to-face, but with COVID, face-to-face, actually face-to-face, even through a screen as what we're doing now, it's really something that they also find enriching, because there are so many things that they can take back from that. Because basically we're asking those journalists during the week to really, I was saying, like, you know, they have to step away from the screen, literally, because the classroom, it's from Monday to Friday, so it's not a side activity. They're going from their newsroom to a classroom and then back to their newsroom. And this energy, for them, it's really something that is that has added value. Now, of course, I mean, we've been training, as I was saying, those journalists. So we have this interactive script that helps them understanding the way to pass on their message to a younger audience, and that's really, I think, the key is also to make sure that those journalists are trained by us. And also we're using this feedback procedure. We integrate feedback in everything that we do. For every classroom visits that we are doing, there is a feedback from the student, from the teacher, and from the journalists. Mainly for us to have this quality control on what we are doing, but also to learn a bit more about what are their needs, what are those evolutions. And for instance, it's really something that came up very early. We realized, for instance, that there is this kind of fake fatigue that is coming. You know, we are talking about to those students and their teachers about about disinformation, about what it is, what you can do, and so on. But one of the main questions in the beginning is like, why do we care? Why do we need to talk about this with you? And why is it important with you as for you as well? And to pass on that message is crucial, because otherwise you end up with someone that would think, okay, well, I put my hands on my laps and I'm just going to believe that everything is a lie, and that's it. And then it's really this factual value that is really important in the transmission. Sorry, I derived a bit, but I think your question. Did I answer your question?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you've highlighted some really important points there. And I think it comes back to that teacher know-how. Actually, everyone who's joining us, wherever you are, I think there's a danger that teachers feel that they don't have relevant knowledge, but actually, if you're in a classroom, you know your students better than anybody else. And that is the strongest starting point for this, isn't it? Is knowing, okay, what do my students find challenging? And then that next step is, I found very interesting, if I may reference back to that visual that you gave us, highlighting how sort of news and online content tends to be visual. So that is, that's another part of that literacy puzzle. And someone's highlighted this idea of data literacy and all these different elements of that jigsaw that we need to understand and know what are students looking at, so that there's relevance, I suppose.
Exactly. And who can do better? I don't know if who can guide a student better than in checking numbers, if you're talking about data literacy, than a biology teacher. So about something, a graph with data on COVID, I would say, it's just that comes to my mind. So that's why it's so important that it's really integrated everywhere, and it's that this topic is not left, let's say, aside for an IT class or for ethic class, which is great, but it should be normally in the curricula as a whole for everybody. Because if I may go on with that, there is, Andreas Schleicher from the OECD is the director for education there, and he puts it very well. He says that, teaching in the 21st century, it's no longer, this vertical transmission of knowledge from teacher to student, but it's really about this this ability to transmit the skill of triangulating information and assessing facts, and then being able to form an opinion. And this skills is now the teaching from 21st century, because we no longer have an encyclopedia to be directed to. We are directed to Google with as many tabs as you like. So before, like a long time ago, we were everybody accepted the fact that by 15, but by the age you're 15, you're able to read, write, and do arithmetics. And now we really need to think about literacy in a different way. You need to be thinking about it by the age of 15. You can read, write, count, and you can verify your sources. And it's like a fundamental change, but that is so important for everybody.
Absolutely. And to go back to the framing point that you gave us from the outset, this like democracy, so being empowered not to be bystanders but upstanding citizens. And just as you were saying about the encyclopedia, in a different life, I researched narratives and travel accounts in the 17th, 18th century, and looked at the first at the Encyclopédie, which was this big moment of documenting knowledge, and I found it really interesting looking back then. So this to say, to give that sort of historical sort of case study, that that the Encyclopédie was heavily coloured by all sorts of narratives and biases and agendas, and it's very I suppose my thinking whenever we come onto this topic is that it's not less a very new problem, but it's a much bigger problem that's sort of morphed and almost come amorphous in how it's presented. And actually, just on that point of bias, and the bias of people who produce these sources and journalistic bias, how do you, if we come back, if I may cycle back to when you're thinking about who you work with, and someone has really helpfully pointed out in the chat that of course journalists, that's their bread and butter, that's their trade of the process of good quality journalism is going researching stories, being sure of your sources, verifying them. But of course it's very hard as individuals, it's very hard to shake off some of our conditioning and biases. And of course, as you were saying about media bias, it's very hard to get away from the fact that a publication might lean. I can think of a few, I don't want to end up being free marketing, that really tries to hit right in the center. But how do you manage that when you're thinking about bringing a journalist into your classroom or whatever education setting, work, or looking to journalists for that good practice? How do you manage your own bias and who you pick, and how do you sort of expose that side of things?
Exactly. I mean, that's why again, that's why we're working with we really tend to be strong on, okay, we're going to work with journalists, because indeed they are the typical professionals who are going to think about that. And that's why we're talking about, again, we have this yin and yang of talking about disinformation, but also talking about information production, because if you don't understand this, then and then you don't trust it, and that's why also that's what we have to work on as well. And to give that trust, it means that you have to have that connection, and you have to have a real journalist in front of you. It's usually, it's very nice, because journalists have been saying a lot that for most of those students, it's the first time they see a journalist. Otherwise they've never seen a journalist. So that's really great to have that connection, and then to really point out, okay, I'm a journalist and I'm trying to do my work, but sometimes things go wrong, because indeed where no one is supernatural, and it's impossible to be without bias. But then it's really important to explain that there is a standard, that they are trying to attain that, and that there is a system behind that holds them accountable, and that there is that's the account, that it's this criteria that makes the difference. They're accountable for their mistakes, and they're the ones that can really explain that in a very intuitive way, and in a very natural way, and that makes everything more human in the end. If you have a real journalist that comes and explains to you, okay, this is fake and this is right, this is not the message that we want to convey. We want to say, okay, there are lies, and then there are there are facts, there are opinions, there are biases, and all of this needs to be understood, because that matters for every citizen, and that matters also for younger citizens, because they're at 10 to 15. It's really a moment where, you know, you shape your worldview and you do that according to your peers. So it's really important that you have this understanding, and even if it's, you know, we're trying to and that's also one of it's really weaved into our session, is we're trying to make it very light. We're playing games. We don't talk about big political issues, about migration, about you know, religious topics, those type of topics that could be contentious. We really keep it at the level of the students, because they can relate to that, you know. And then once the mechanism is there, once there is you know, a flexing of this critical muscle that can be done on this topic, then it can be redirected later on different topics. And then you're in the situation when you don't want to tell people what to think, but you want to tell them to think. Simply, it's as simply as that. It's really, they need to think, not think this way or that way. But really, and also another message that I think is really important, and then we try to convey, is really to have the students and whomever actually, that counts for all of us, facing information or disinformation, is really to take a step back, you know, to breathe. And that's really super important. There is a Ian Volbracht that does this great TED talk about this. Is really this moment when you think, when you want to think too much about it, when you want to, when it gives, when it touches you, when you become emotional, that's the moment when you have to just stop and breathe. And that's also one thing that that we really try to pass on. I hope I did answer your question.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm scribbling because there's so, as ever, Adeline, things that I'd love to sort of pull out. And I'm looking over at the Q&A, and I think a very interesting sort of query, reflection, question that's come in closer to you over from Germany. And I think it's, to borrow what the Week often, a section of that publication, they talk about the spirit of the age and this idea, can we trust journalists? So we're talking about them being our information, our current affairs, the gatekeepers. And, you know, on the one hand, we've had some people who've joined us have highlighted that, you know, good journalism, they go through that process of, you know, stopping to think. And of course, you know, those who are working in the related industry, the fact-checking, the sort of the standard, the gold standard that's being developed there is that, you know, you should be very transparent, show your process so someone can replicate it. So there's a lot of openness and really willingness to encourage others to engage in the same processing. And this becomes, I suppose, a big question mark. Can we look to journalists before we cycle back to the work? And this is, yes, to play devil's advocate. Are they the right people to help us on this journey? Are they too close to the material itself? I think we probably need 3 hours to debate that question. But what are your immediate thoughts? Anything that's come on your radar?
That's really an interesting question. I think, I mean, I'm biased because I work with journalists, so I need to tell you, yes, please. But it's a really interesting question. I think in the end, it's not about trusting every journalist because they are journalists. Indeed, that would be a wrong answer. And that's, again, you know, I mean, obviously when we go into a classroom with the journalists, they're not telling the students, okay, I'm working for newspaper X, please read it, it's very nice, and those are facts, and everything is wrong. That's not what we're doing. I think it's the goal of lie detectors is really to empower the students and their teachers to realize that they can do something about whatever they see. So that's to say that they're not helpless in the face of disinformation, that there are tools for them, and that doesn't mean that it matches it's that, you know, it is tools from journalist X or Y. It's just that they can help themselves, and it's worth it. It's worth actually checking their online news feed. It's worth checking their information, because in the end, nobody likes to get fooled, and that's, I think, something that is really intuitive. And yeah, so I think it's about empowering rather than trusting. Obviously, it's a side effect, because as I said earlier, if you don't trust journalists, then you don't trust fact checkers, and then you don't trust the process. So it's about the process of verifying, and the process of really understanding that it is kind of crucial to do that in our world, in today's world, because again, we're in this world where we have um, um, uh, Facebook and other platforms, Google, Twitter, YouTube, and all the platforms we've seen in the graphs earlier. And there are some people, there is this attention of economy. I think you discussed that earlier. It exists. It's a system where we are all navigating, and you should have tools to navigate that, because there is this use of outrage, there is this monetizing of human emotions that is actually using citizens. So it's this money-making machine that is actually building on those processes we're not aware of. And so rather than talking about do we trust journalist X or Y or media X and Y, it's more about you have tools and you can be you're in power here. You're not defenseless, you're not helpless. There are things you can do, I would say. Does that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I've just been thinking it before we get to dig down into those tools more. And I think what you say about empowerment and process, and also I think what you touch upon is we're all human, and even, well, we could, before we go down the sort of rabbit hole of on the one hand saying maybe a computer can do it better, and we start talking about the bias in algorithms, of course, before we start going down the rabbit hole of nothing is true, so we end up in these sort of postmodernist debates that language can't convey our world, and we could, that's again could be another hour's discussion. I suppose, practically speaking, there are things, as you were saying, there are things that we can do, and indeed, not just, I suppose, the other bit of the context, just in terms of journalists and the role they play, and someone's making the good point that, of course, money can drive opinions, of course, as well. That there is a lot of training for journalists to try and function as best they can in this very noisy, confusing, challenging environment where they're being required to bring good quality news stories and the so-called truth as quickly as possible. And we have had over the summer, even that, the places that you might go for the most authoritative information themselves finding that, putting out, I won't call names at this point, but if you go to Full Fact, for example, you will see there's a whole host of sort of case studies where you can see all sorts, even the best journalists, we're only human, we're not infallible. And these things do happen. So we're all working on this together. And if I may, Adeline, come down on some of the sort of pragmatics that, so we've got the good news is that there are things that we can do. And there's lots of super initiatives sort of working alongside yourselves in this space. If for interest, I will put the link for everybody in a moment. GoViralGame.com, that's an initiative that's come out of Cambridge recently, using this idea of gamification. What does it look like to pretend to read fake news and things? So there are things that you can access, and that's free to access. So what about what are the sort of activities? So you get we've bridged the gap, and hopefully got a reasonable a journalist whom we feel is not going to impart the biases of their publication. We have our teachers who know their students really well. We've set ourselves up with thinking that this, let's call it broadly, information literacy can happen not just in a language lesson, or history, it can happen in science. So what are some of the activities, what are the things that we can do to get things started? What are the sort of things that you found have worked well, especially, I suppose, in this COVID period? What are the things that we can suggest?
Maybe I can share my screen again to show something. Probably it will be nicer.
Just to pick up, give you a breather, Adeline. No panic as you find your way around. To pick up on some of the things that are in the chat, we've got sort of this doxing, malinformation. That's been sort of flagged as this challenge of how quickly people's reputations can be affected very quickly, and that, I think, is picking up, because we did talk about this whole cancel culture challenge, I suppose, that we have at the minute. So thank you for that point.
I think this works, right?
Yeah, super. Oh, and I'm going to have to, someone's given me a super parallel example to the encyclopedia. Thank you. I'm going to have to start Googling that, talking of getting your information. So yes, over to you. Yeah. And we've got just about sort of 10 minutes left.
Okay, I'll rush through this, but I wanted to show you, this is something that we usually pass on when we are discussing with teachers. It's really like simple principles to keep in mind whatever you're doing. It's really that this doesn't need to be complicated at first. Just as I said earlier, you don't need to get into those big heavy topics, because this is usually also what keeps us from really tackling this with young people, is that we think it's going to be complicated, talking about, you know, Discord, or if you're not on Discord and then you have to talk to your student about Discord, this seems crazy. You can keep it light as a topic. Not everything is harmful, so that's to say that there are things that don't that can be jokes, and it's all right to have jokes and this type of things. And then yeah, you should maybe pick your battles. That's to say that we are so into this, it might feel so overwhelming, can do everything, and that's okay. Step by step, it's possible to tackle that, and probably, as I said earlier, to really think about taking that step back, and to have a breather sometime. That's for really this day-to-day principles to keep in mind when tackling this. And we're doing that simply with sometimes checklists. You know, it doesn't need to be, sorry, this is a bit crowded because it's supposed to be a PowerPoint, but it doesn't need to be very complicated. The use of checklists that are universal, that are, for instance, this is from IFLA, the International Federation of Librarians. Librarians are, by the way, there's also those you know, information gatekeepers that are really interesting to work with if you're thinking in terms of other stakeholders. And so yes, you can, you know, use those tools to really remind yourself to have like flex that critical muscle, as I mentioned. And then I think we can also talk about very oops, is it? I have it before. Oh no, that's our journalist. Maybe I can show you that as well, but later on. We have also very, you know, they're using our checklist here with the students. And yes, we have very good examples. And as you mentioned, there's gamification. And that's also part of what you can do to tackle this in a very light but efficient way. There are tons of games that are out there. I'm thinking about Get Bad News. Have you heard of this?
No, get bad
Exactly. Get
news.
bad news. It's maybe I can also talk about that. I will share it. I had it prepared. It's so Get Bad News is this game that is developed in different languages, and it's really developed on the principle of inoculation. That's to say, you are going to be the bad guy that does disinformation. And that way, by building disinformation, then you understand how to unbuild it when you see it. And it's an amazing, very funny game. There it is. I'm getting better at this screen sharing. Um, so it is available in many languages, as you say here, Czech, Dutch, German, Greek, Esperanto, you name it. And it's an amazing tool to really make it light, make it fun. And yeah, as you see, you're this fake news monger and you have no ethics, and your goal is to really have that disinformation spread as far as possible. It's hilarious, and it's really working well for all audiences. I had other ones, but I don't know where it is in my share screen, so I cannot show it to you. But it was there are so many different things. There was this BBC iReporter game as well, so it puts you in the shoes of a reporter. And then maybe lastly, something that I can show, and that would be actually very nice because I haven't talked about it. You know, there was the pandemic, and we had to rethink everything at lie detectors. We had to really think about how to still keep on working with the teachers and the students, because we actually had we took the time to interview everybody. What do they want? What do they need? Are they thinking about this now that there is lockdown, now that there is this extremely anxious atmosphere? And actually their answer was yes. And so we developed those worksheets. And again, it's the same principle as BBC Reporter, for instance. You put yourself in in the shoes of a news detective or a young reporter, and then you have to figure out with your checklist whether this news story about garlic water curing the coronavirus, is it true? Is it not true? And those are real examples, and it worked. I mean, we developed it from March to July with teachers in those different countries, and it worked very well because it's a good way to again have those questions, but also this understanding of how does a journalist work. So there are so many resources available. I'd be happy to share a few after the session if you're interested, because there is no shortage of that out there. But it is about really understanding where it is and where to find it. And there are amazing things out there, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel at the end of the day, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think perhaps that's the positive note to end on, because I feel, as one person mentioned in some of the micro lectures that went up as part of the course, oof, this is quite overwhelming. This is such a big challenge. But the heartening, I suppose, takeaway that we alighted upon also with Jeanette is that, yes, there's a lot of motion, there's a lot of awakening really in this arena, a lot of people working on various outfits, various projects, various tools. I'm contributing to, there's a European project looking for that best practice called Elinet, and I can share that as a link for everybody as well. And that's really starting to help us. And I think that's what's really come out of this snapshot. Thank you so much, Adeline, for speaking about the sort of lie detectors work. And there's so many other things that we could have transversed together as well. There's the question of policy. There's the question of how things have changed in the past 6 months, how things will go on to change. But I think really I suppose the takeaway here is that we all have an individual responsibility. The starting point is understanding ourselves, these processes. And it's also, it's looking beyond our education, setting perimeters, those boundaries, looking at what people in parallel sectors, in, you know, private, not-for-profit, the charitable sector, governmental organizations, what is happening elsewhere. I mean, speaking personally, I found it at once exhilarating, yet quite daunting, trying to sort of keep up and see what's happening in this space. But certainly, I think our starting point is, as I say, looking beyond those perimeters and looking for that sort of connected approach, really. And as you say, you know, it can, I suppose that's all, it can start quite small and manageable, and really, you know, start with those who are close to home. So people who manage your library, you know, the libraries, you know, the information gate. There's so much knowledge, really untapped resource. Or let's think of other, you know, the curators, museums, people who work, you know, civil servants, local institutions, whose whole job is to understand all sorts of sources, whether they're 1,000 years old, whether they're textural, or they're sculptures or paintings. And I think that's just the fascination perhaps with this area, is that we start to see this fundamental skill that can underpin all these subjects, can really reinvigorate our practice as educators, and hopefully, as you said, sort of encourage children, the next generation, or indeed adults if you're in a setting, because of course, not to forget that we're all facing this challenge, that, you know, there are things that we can do, and it's a corporate challenge and opportunity, shall we say.
Exactly.
And we've got, I'd love to pick up, I can see some other things coming in the Q&A and the chat, and some very good points on why people might even start with to produce fake news. And I feel that should be the topic of the next outing, as and when we can. But thank you so much again. Very much coming in at 11th hour in a very, very busy period. And it's been really, really good to hear one of the snapshots of moments of hope, glimmers of, say, hope and things that we can do in these challenging circumstances.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us. It was really, it's not every day that you get to talk to so many people that are so invested already in this topic. And so, yes, it has been a great pleasure. And yes, I'm amazed by your what you've set up here, because I think it's really through those places of exchanges that we can all kind of feed each other's perspectives and really, as we said, just build those bridges. We're doing that right now with everybody here, and I think that's an important moment to have.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as someone else has pointed out, of course, we've got scientists, people working in labs, and of course the scientists are the people who are working so hard for us also at the minute. So you're absolutely, you know, building those bridges through this. And thank you so much at this point. If I can thank you to everyone who's kindly joined us today. I hope you found this a elucidation of some of these topics, and of course we could go on much longer, but I see we're 3 minutes past the hour wherever we might be. So at this point, a final thank you also to my colleagues Kirk and Courtney, who have joined from London and Canada, and really a final thank you to everyone who's joined us. And I hope you have some of those tangible takeaways. I keep coming back to that, and things to really try out, trial and error. That we all start, we want perfection, we want to have all the results straight away, but you know, you have to start small and see where you go, I think.
Exactly.